African diaspora, there are connections you don't always see, but you feel. Not in language, not always in culture, but in survival. Because for many Black Americans, there's an understanding, quiet, inherited, rarely explained out loud, that's not always safe to speak to the police. And that understanding was learned through years of abuse, through systems that were never designed to protect us, from a time when authority didn't just wear badges, they wore sheets in the night. And somehow those same ideologies could show up the next morning in a courtroom, on a bench, behind a badge, or sitting in a jury box labeled your peers, but never truly seeing you as one. So silence? Silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't avoidance. It was strategy, protection, survival. But what we don't talk about enough is how the same silence exists beyond the American experience. Because across the diaspora, for those who look like us, there are communities who learn that same lesson, just under different conditions, in places like Haiti, where dictatorship meant that authority wasn't just feared, it was dangerous. Where speaking too freely to the wrong person could cost you everything. So imagine what happens when those histories meet. Different countries, different timelines, same instinct. Because in Spring Valley, New York, this wasn't just a neighborhood. It was community shaped by migration, memory, and caution. A place where people carried what they survived into how they lived, into who they trusted, and more importantly, who they didn't. And that's where the story begins, because when Rene Charles was murdered, the answers weren't missing. They were there, sitting in conversations whispered in corners, held in people who knew more than they said. But the silence, it wasn't about not caring. It wasn't about not wanting justice. It was about something deeper. Because sometimes a case doesn't go cold because people don't know anything. Sometimes it goes cold because they do. On October 21st, 1994, in Spring Valley, New York, police received a call a little after 8 a.m. A friend, Philomena Jean-Baptiste, was inquiring if they could conduct a welfare check on her friend, 56-year-old Rene Charles. Officers were dispatched to Rene's home. The neighborhood was relatively safe, no violent crimes. There were 3 cars parked in the driveway. But as they approached the driveway, they saw a male body leaning sideways from a car. The man looked mid-50s, well-dressed, and there was a large pool of blood surrounding his body. The victim's body was cold, suggesting that he had been deceased for a number of hours, and it appeared he was shot several times. His wallet was missing, his house keys were nearby. It appeared he was going to open his house door when he was hit from behind. They searched the home and there were no other victims. It appeared Rene was targeted. Rene's family was called out to the home. They saw his car and the blood, and they couldn't believe their father was deceased. He had an older son and daughter who showed up to the scene. They were frantic and absolutely taken by surprise that someone would want to murder their father. So police tracked down Philomena Jean-Baptiste, the friend that initially called to conduct the welfare check. They needed to know what she knew, or maybe what she knew about the days prior. Naturally, they inquired about her relationship with Rene, and she claimed they had been good friends for several years. However, she said she spoke to him the night before because he was at the hospital with his wife, who was battling stage 4 cancer. He promised that after he arrived at home in the morning, he would give her a call. And when he didn't call or pick up when she phoned, she became worried and requested a welfare check. She didn't know anyone who would commit this crime and really had no further information to give detectives. When news of Rene's death traveled throughout the community, everyone was baffled. Rene was a businessman and a mentor within the community, and officers began to canvass the neighborhood, hoping that something significant would surface. But no information came forward and no witnesses came forward to speak to this great man that meant so much to the community. And as I was working through this case, something stood out almost immediately. That didn't feel distant. It felt familiar. And I don't mean the details, I mean the energy of it. Because being a part of the Black American experience, there are certain understandings you carry, whether they were ever formally explained to you or not. You learn how to read the room, you learn when to speak and when not to, and you learn that sometimes what you know isn't as important as what you can safely say out loud. And that doesn't come from nowhere. That comes from history, from experiences, from watching how things play out. When I looked at Spring Valley, a Haitian community navigating this moment, I didn't see a disconnect. I saw a parallel. Because across the African diaspora, our histories may not be identical, but they move in similar ways. And in Haiti, the history is marked by something very specific, by dictatorship, by regimes where authority wasn't just respected, it was feared, where speaking too freely or trusting the wrong person could come with consequences that didn't stop with you. And when you grow up in that kind of environment, you don't just unlearn it because you change locations, you carry it. So when people ask why no one spoke up about Rene Charles's murder if they had information, why didn't they just come forward? That question assumes that people felt safe enough to do so. And that's not always the reality, because if you're understanding authority and the way that it has been shaped for Haitians by danger, then silence doesn't register as avoidance. It registers as control, protection, survival. And as someone rooted in the Black experience, I couldn't ignore how closely that mirrors what we've learned here. The detectives really were at a crossroads. They had a community hero, helper, businessman who seemingly was targeted at his home, but no one is coming forward with information. One of the first things they knew they needed to do was speak to Renee's family members. And they started with his daughter, Mildred, and her brother. They were able to give detectives a clear picture on who Rene was. Rene was born in Port Salut, Haiti in 1938. He was a devout Catholic. He once wanted to become a priest. That was how strong his faith was. But under Papa Doc's rule, there was extreme persecution for those who were a part of the church. So he decided to pivot and began studying philosophy. And that's when he met Claire, and they married. Under that regime, they decided that it was best if they immigrated to the United States for better opportunities. And they arrived in 1969 and settled in Spring Valley. Now, I want you to know that a lot of people from Haiti decided to leave under the regime of Papa Doc because they were facing so much persecution and they just could not have the opportunities that they wanted to have in their homeland. And as a result, many immigrated to the U.S. And a lot of Haitians found themselves building a community in Spring Valley. Just 1 year later, Rene founded the Rockland Haitian Center. It helped other Haitians illegally come to the United States. He knew the law and he wanted to help his people achieve the same opportunity that he now had in Spring Valley. Rene had 4 children with Claire. They had 3 girls and 1 boy. And one of the first things he did when he expanded his family was to instill faith and culture deeply into his children and his family unit. His daughter said that their culture was always felt, even outside their homeland. And Spring Valley, at least at that time, I don't know what it is like now, because of course I know of the large Haitian community in Florida, but had no idea until this case that Spring Valley was plentiful with Haitians that made their own community. And it was dubbed Little Haiti in Spring Valley. For his daughter, Mildred, she really spoke about how the community joined together. You could count on one another because you had this shared experience. This home away from home is what Spring Valley was for the Haitian community. Now, Rene was known for his giving. Not only had he started a business dedicated to helping others coming over to the United States from Haiti, but he would make sure that if you were in a pinch or you were in a bind, he was always there to give out money or even give out his shoes. You heard me right. Mildred recounted that she heard stories of her father, and one story that stuck with her is that her father literally gave the shoes off of his feet to someone who complimented him for his shoes. That pretty much embodies, and he'll give you the shirt off of his back. But that was his reality, and that was his mentality. He wanted to do whatever he could to help out his fellow man. When someone is always giving outward, it sometimes leaves the people closest to them feeling overlooked, neglected. And that eventually created tension in his marriage to Claire. Because even generosity without boundaries can create imbalance. Rene eventually remarried to Georgina. His children grew close to her. For 10 years, life was good until Georgina was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Rene's days would look like him going to his business, handling work, and then he would visit her daily at the hospital, returning home every day around 8 p.m. After detectives were able to get a picture of who Rene was in the community, what his home life looked like, what his family looked like, and what his schedule followed every day since his wife had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, they now went to interview most of the family. Rene's children were tasked with telling Georgina, Rene's wife, that he had been killed. And when they told her, she was saddened, but she didn't appear to be shocked. And that often sits very oddly with true crime fans. And to be honest with you, it can sit oddly with detectives and family members because Rene seemed to be an everyday guy. He handled business. He helped the community. This was the last person that anyone thought would be targeted and murdered. For Rene's children to tell his wife, who was terminally ill, that her husband was killed, and she wasn't shocked, well, it didn't sit right, and they wondered why. But that's when she quickly revealed something no one knew. She said Rene and Philomena were having an affair. She claimed she found a receipt that he had given Philomena a ring. Rene's family wasn't just grieving their father, they were trying to understand him. And those are two very different things because grief on its own is already disorienting. It comes in waves. It doesn't ask permission and it doesn't give you time to prepare. But what happens when grief is interrupted by revelation? Because within hours, maybe days of learning that their father had been murdered, another truth surfaces. Not gently, not over time, all at once. That he had been involved with someone they knew. Not a stranger, not someone distant, a family friend. They considered Philomena's children their cousins. That kind of information doesn't just add to grief, it complicates it because now you're not just mourning who someone was, you're questioning what you thought you knew. You're replaying moments, looking back at interactions that once felt normal and now feel different. And there's no roadmap for that. And I don't want to blow by that because I think we look at these true crime cases and we act as if this just happens in a very succinct way and very quickly the case was solved and there was some emotional fallout, but that shouldn't be mitigated. When Rene's children go to the police with this newfound information that there could possibly be a love triangle, because not only was Rene married, but so was Philomena. And she was married for over 20 years. This looks like motive. And when they tell detectives, they knew they needed to speak to Georgina. They go to her hospital and find out she's passed away before they could even speak to her and get more information about this alleged affair. Detectives discovered that Philomena had been married to Daniel Jean-Baptiste, who was also a close friend of Rene. As a matter of fact, Rene was responsible for bringing Philomena and Daniel over to the United States from Haiti. And Philomena introduced Rene to Daniel. Rumors started to spread like wildfire in the Spring Valley community, and Philomena was described as quiet, family centered. Rene was outgoing, giving, a businessman and mentor. And to many in the community, that dynamic just didn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, by no means am I saying that anyone viewed Rene as a saint, but for sure they didn't think a man who was devoted to his wife, who was terminally ill, would step out on her with a family friend. And Philomena just never seemed like the type who would do something like this. The first course of action, of course, was to talk to Philomena again. And they discovered that after 20 years of marriage, Philomena revealed Daniel struggled to keep a job. She had become the main provider and became tired of having to do all the heavy lifting on her own in the relationship. And she admitted that they were separated. Now, during this separation, Rene was someone that she leaned on very heavily for support, but she maintained that they were not in a romantic relationship. But she also was very forthcoming, saying that Daniel did not like that she was heavily relying on Rene for support, and he believed that their relationship was inappropriate. And because of that, tension built. When emotional support crosses into dependency, do you think people always recognize the line when it's happening, or only after it's already been crossed? So they go and they speak to Daniel Jean-Baptiste because they have to figure out, was there something to this situation? Because she's still maintaining they didn't have an affair. Georgina said they had an affair, but Georgina is now gone. And is Daniel going to give them any type of information? Because this is on track, on par to being a love triangle gone wrong. So they speak to Daniel, and Daniel at this time is separated from Philomena. He's living in his own apartment, and he admits that, yes, they were married and they are experiencing a lot of contention within their relationship because he became jealous of the relationship between Rene and his wife. He claimed that he was once really good friends with Rene. Rene was the godfather of his oldest child. And before Rene was murdered, he claimed that they went to this mediation, like a therapy session with all three of them to try to figure out what was going on with the relationship between Rene and Philomena. And was there anything to it? And he claimed that after they did this therapy session, really nothing came of it and their relationship didn't change. They continued to lean on each other in a way that he didn't see as appropriate. So he decided that he was just going to cut off his friendship with Rene, but Philomena, of course, didn't. They began to probe him further because they could see very clearly throughout this interview that he was bothered by the relationship between Philomena and Rene. They outright asked him, do you believe that Philomena and Rene were having a sexual relationship? And he says no, but he was jealous of the bond that they developed. They asked him the question that was lurking the entire interview. Did you have anything to do with Rene's murder? And he denied it. He also gave them an alibi. At the time, he was working as a taxi driver. He said that shift ended at 8 o'clock, and he returned home around 8:30 to 9 p.m. This was confirmed by his roommates who were staying at the apartment and also his daughter who came to visit that night and retrieve money from him. They had nothing to hold Daniel on, and his alibi checked out, so he was released. And detectives were back at square one. The lead that seemed somewhat promising and a revelation that shocked Rene's family of the affair seemed to not work out, and everyone involved had an alibi. So they were back at square one. Weeks turned into months, and of course, months turned into years. And eventually the case went cold. 13 years passed until two names entered the chat, or should I say the case. Detective Roxanne Lopez and patrolman at the time, Rene Charles. Ronnie was known in the Haitian community. He could break barriers others couldn't. And Roxanne decided to revisit the case. One of the main items that she looked at again was Rene's wallet. If you remember at the beginning, I said they didn't find Rene's wallet at the scene. However, in the days after Rene's murder, an elderly couple was out walking their dog. And that's when they found Rene's wallet. Now, inside, there was no money and there were no fingerprints. So that wallet was put in the evidence file, not believing that it could garner any type of leads. But Roxanne looked back at this wallet and she opened it up and began to just browse through the compartments of the wallet. And she discovered a hidden compartment. Inside, there was a bank receipt of 3 transactions dating back 3 years. She found one from 1992, another in 93, and then another one in 1994. And they all tied to one account, Philomena Jean-Baptiste. Now, because she had to find this in his wallet, like she had to search his wallet, it was hidden in this compartment. She believed that Rene was trying to hide these transaction receipts. So she decided that she needed to revisit the relationship between Philomena and Rene again. So she pays Philomena a visit. And at first, Philomena is very welcoming. She invites Detective Roxanne in, offers her something to drink, sits her down, talks to her very freely about her day and what she's been doing. But when Detective Roxanne got to business and asked her about Rene's case and that they were interested in opening it back up, well, Philomena's attitude turned completely left. She became cold, stiff, and very quickly told Detective Roxanne to hit the door. She didn't want to help to solve or answer questions about Rene Charles' case. Now, for a detective, for anybody with a rational brain, that doesn't seem right, does it? After all, Philomena was cooperative with investigators in years prior. Why had her attitude changed now? Now, she didn't want to answer any questions, so Detective Roxanne couldn't ask her if they had an affair or not. So, based on everything that she had said up until this point, Rene was a good friend of hers. So, why wouldn't she want to help? Detective Roxanne knew that something in the water wasn't clean. Something stunk, and she needed to get to the bottom of it. So, she used the skills of Officer Rene Charles to go into the Haitian community and start asking questions. Now, you might be saying, Steph, we already tried that. They tried to canvass the community. They tried to canvass the neighborhood, and nobody came forward for reasons that we already discussed. But Officer Rene Charles wasn't just another officer assigned to a case. He was Haitian. He was a part of the community. And that's a distinction. It mattered more than people might realize because when trust has been shaped by fear, people don't respond to authority the same way. They don't open up just because someone has a badge. They're paying attention to something deeper. Who are you really? Do you understand us? Can I speak freely without it costing me later? And Officer Charles, in many ways, was able to answer those questions without having to say much at all because he wasn't walking into Spring Valley as an outsider trying to extract information. He was someone who already understood the language, not just linguistically, but culturally. He understood the pauses, the hesitations, the things people say without saying directly. And even that's important because one of the people who were working the case back in 1994 was a Black American. And you might say, well, he was a part of the diaspora, but culturally, he was different. He was an outsider, whereas Officer Rene Charles wasn't. He was a part of the community, and he was able to ask questions that others couldn't. So he began talking to people in the community, asking them about Rene's murder and if anybody had anything to do with it. And one thing that he kept hearing was that Daniel was very jealous of the affair that Philomena was having with Rene. And Daniel even solicited murder for hire for Rene being permanently gone. And he was enlisting people in the community that were problems, that had a reputation for either getting into crime or being involved in crime in some way or another. And one name that he kept hearing was Jean Lazare. Now, when they tried to go into the community looking for Jean, they discovered that he had been deported to Haiti after a drug conviction. And Roxanne, equipped with being just an overall baddie in the best way possible, handling cold cases and solving them. She also was a U.S. Marshal, and she used her contacts in Haiti to find Jean Lazare. I'm not saying that without her contacts as a U.S. Marshal that they would not have been able to eventually track him down. I'm just saying it would have been difficult for them to do so. They found out that Jean Lazare was working in somewhere in the kitchen of the airport. He was living his life, minding his business. And Roxanne decided to go over to Haiti in October of 2012. She begins to talk to Jean Lazare. And he opens up and is very cooperative. As a matter of fact, pretty much everybody in this case, as we're talking about the various interviews, they all start off cooperative. They're friendly. They open up and talk and bloom just like a flower. But as she's talking to him and talking about why he was deported and how was his life in Haiti and what was he was up to, she brings up Rene Charles' name. And Lazare, who was friendly at first, his demeanor changed, but not in the way that Philomena's changed. He actually shifted in his seat and became upright. And he said, well, you do know that Rene and Philomena were having an affair. And so, of course, Detective Roxanne knows about the affair. And he begins to speak very freely at this point. He describes an argument between Daniel and Philomena over the paternity of a child. Now, Daniel believed the child was his, but Philomena, upset, claimed that only 2 children were his, and the one child that they were speaking of, which was a girl, was not his. That child belonged to Rene. Quick pause just in case you're locked in right now. I want to make sure that you're subscribed to Murder in the Black and you press that bell icon so that you can keep up on our updates. For exclusive episodes and subscriber-only content, consider becoming a paid subscriber. Here's a little nugget. We have a 3-day free trial on Apple Podcasts just in case you want to figure out the lay of the land first before you commit. Storytime with Steph is back. That is where I present many true crime stories you won't always hear on our main feed, but the stories deserve to be told. You can watch that on whatever social media platform you enjoy us on. But I especially want those of you who are on TikTok to know that I'm back, and this is where we started our Murder in the Black community. One more quick favor. Make sure you leave a 5-star rating and review if you enjoy the work here. Let's get back into our story. Now, we're talking about the Haitian community. I'm going to need my Haitian community to tap in. Y'all got to tap in for this episode. But it's said that in the Haitian community, respect is a huge dynamic. And I think it is for most people, especially amongst men. But they emphasize in the Haitian community that level of betrayal. Not only is she having an affair with Rene, but now the children that was assumed to all be Daniel's, now she's saying only 2 of those children are yours. And this one girl over here, no, this baby belongs to Rene. Well, that was betrayal on a different level, and it cut deep. Now, according to Lazare, he said that when that came out, when that portion of the betrayal was revealed, that's when Daniel started to solicit a murder for hire plot against Rene because Rene had to go. And Daniel approached Lazare with an offer. He said he would give him $5,000 to kill Rene, and Lazare asked for the payment up front. He said, well, if I'm going to murder somebody, I at least need that $5,000 in my hand. Daniel didn't believe that he really was going to do it if he received the money up front. Is that smart of him? Is that not? I don't know. Who really knows why Lazare backed out? But he did. He claimed that he told Daniel if he wanted this done, that he would have to handle it. After all, this was his dirty deed. It was his business. But he believed that Daniel went to a mutual friend they had named Mucchi Toussaint. And he believed that maybe he offered Mucci the same deal, but maybe Mucci said something similar to him because for a while, nothing happened with Rene. Rene was still living his life. When Lazar heard of the murder of Rene, he knew then that it was Mucci Toussaint who committed the murder of Rene Charles. Now, he had no proof of any of these dealings. This is just what he believed happened back in 1994. Now, this is not hard proof, but it is a story that Detective Roxanne and Officer Rene Charles know they need to continue to investigate and make sure they go through all the leads of this case. Police tracked down Mucci Toussaint, who now has moved from Spring Valley, New York to Florida, where he is a long truck haul driver. They want to approach him carefully because they don't necessarily think Jean Lazar is going to tip him off, right? Because he's back in Haiti. But they don't want to rock the boat. They want to get as much information as possible. They track him down and they lead him on with a story. They say, hey, listen, we have a possible identity theft issue and we want to help you. So when's the next time you think you'll be in New York? Which wasn't a far cry because like I said, he was a long haul truck driver. So him being in and out of states wasn't anything that was unordinary. Like everybody else that they had spoke to before, he seemed very friendly. He said, sure, I would love for you to help me out. I'll be in New York at this particular time. And they sit him down for an interview. And he begins to talk to them, lets them know what he's been doing in the years since he moved from Spring Valley. And then they deviate from the small talk and they begin to talk about Rene Charles's murder. And just like everybody else, in different ways, his mannerisms and demeanor changes. And they ask him questions and he becomes stiff and his face changes. They apply pressure. And they say, do you know of Rene Charles? And he says yes. And they begin to talk about Philomena Jean-Baptiste and also Daniel and also Jean Lazar. And he mentions, yes, I know of all of these people because at the time that I was living in Spring Valley, I hung around them. I was in communication with them, but I don't know anything about Rene Charles' murder. Now, once again, they know they're going down the right rabbit hole, but they don't have enough evidence to hold Mucci Toussaint. And so they know they need to go directly to Daniel Jean-Baptiste and see if by chance, after all these years have gone by, would he be willing to relieve his conscience? They do track him down, and he's still living in Spring Valley, New York, but he's much older. He comes in for an interview, willing to speak with detectives. He talks about how he raised his children, raised his family, kind of goes through the biography of his life with detectives. And when they ask him about his wife, he says, oh, well, we divorced because she was cheating on me. And he still had a little bit of tension from recounting how his marriage ended in divorce. And for Detective Roxanne, she knew that this was an opening to talk about Rene Charles' murder. But she doesn't begin with that. As a matter of fact, when she went down to Haiti to talk to Jean Lazar, she taped that interview with him because she wanted to be able to go back and replay things for herself and her team. But maybe if she ever had Daniel Jean-Baptiste in her crosshairs, she could play it for him. Well, she did. She opened up her laptop and she began to play the interview. And like everyone else, when he saw Jean Lazar and heard Jean Lazar talking about the paternity of one of his children, Daniel soliciting Jean Lazar for murder, his demeanor changed. And if it was possible for Daniel Jean-Baptiste to turn as white as a ghost, I'm sure that this would be the time that he would do so. But he didn't. He began to cry, hang his head low, and he just confessed. He said, yes, he was responsible for the murder of Rene Charles. They asked him for a full confession. And according to Daniel, his wife, Philomena, was involved in a long-standing affair with Rene Charles. It was more than what he could bear. So he decided that Rene had to go. and he solicited the murder to Jean Lazare, but when he declined, he got Mucchi Toussaint to do it. Prior to soliciting Mucci, he already started to study Rene Charles's routine, what he did every day, where he would be at certain times. And once Mucci decided that he would go forward in the murder of Rene Charles, he picked Mucci up on the night of the murder and he dropped Mucci off in an alleyway near Rene's home. He said he then began to drive off. And as he was driving off, he heard several shots. He circled the block, went around for a while, and eventually went back to that same alleyway where he dropped Mucci off. And Mucci gets back in the car and says, "The job is done." Daniel drops Mucci off at home, and he goes home, and they never speak of it again. On April 2nd, 2013, Jean-Baptiste pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Daniel was released in June of 2021, and Mucchi Toussaint is believed to have fled the United States and is believed to be in Haiti. No charges were ever filed against him. The case of Rene Charles was a disruption, or at least it felt like one. A disruption of trust, familiarity to the people who moved within their own community. Spring Valley, for many in the Haitian community, wasn't just where you lived, it was how you survived. It was built on connection, on showing up without needing to be asked, on the understanding that if something happened, you weren't facing it alone. There was a rhythm to that kind of community, an ease, a knowing. And then something like this happens, and that rhythm gets interrupted. Betrayal, especially when it's close, it doesn't stay contained. It lingers, it spreads, it shifts how people see each other. And now that same closeness that felt like safety within Spring Valley starts to feel like something you have to be careful with. Who knows what? Who's connected to who? What didn't I see? And slowly the sense of we turns into, I just need to look out for me. Not overnight, but over time, where people aren't as quick to depend on one another, not as open, not as trusting. And in some ways, it starts to mirror a more individualistic way of living. Not because people wanted it, but because something made it feel necessary. And at the center of all of this is Rene, a man, by so many accounts, gave freely, who people leaned on, who created space for others in a way that made him a constant in people's lives. And there's something about people like that. They become more than just individuals. They become a part of the structure of the community, almost larger than life in some ways. But even that kind of presence can carry complexity. Because when you're available to everyone, you don't always see where lines begin to blur. You don't always recognize when connection starts to shift into something else, when trust starts to take on a different meaning. And then after he's gone, those layers begin to surface. And now his family isn't just grieving him, they're learning him in a way they never had to before. And that's a different kind of pain because it's not just loss, it's adjustment, trying to hold on to who someone was to you, while also making space for the parts of their life you didn't fully see. And this is where true crime gets uncomfortable because we like stories that are clear, where everything fits like a perfect puzzle, where people are easy to define. But Rene Charles wasn't. He, like most of us, sit in the gray because Rene can be remembered as someone who gave, who showed up, who mattered. And at the same time, there can be decisions, relationships, moments that complicate how we understand his life. Not erase it, but deepen it. And then there's everything else layered on top: jealousy, proximity, access, emotions that don't always announce themselves until they're already taken root. And when all of that exists inside a community that already knows how to be cautious, silence doesn't feel unusual. It feels expected. Because people aren't just processing what happened, they're trying to understand what it means for them. for how they move, for how they trust, for what safety looks like. And even when answers come, even when things are said out loud, it doesn't rewind anything. A life, Rene's life, was still lost. A family is still left holding pieces that don't settle the way they once did. And Daniel Jean-Baptiste is able to grow old, live a life with his children, raise his grandchildren, walk down the aisle with his daughters. But Rene, that was taken from him. What stays with me the most in this case is not just who did it, but how many layers existed in this dynamic, how many quiet changes had to happen for everything to unfold the way that it did and in the time that it did. Because sometimes it's not just one moment, it's several. And unfortunately, a case does have to go cold in order for detectives to reanalyze the evidence, talk to the community, and eventually solve the case. That will do it for our episode for today. But before we leave, I have an update in a case that we've been covering. This is our update in true crime and current news. Now, last Thursday, I was putting all of our content on all of our social media platforms. And right when I was about to post, I got a Google alert about the Naziah Harris case. And some people view this as good news. Other people view it as a loss in the case. But what I will do is give you a full recap of the Naziah Harris case. And also, I will feature in our show notes where you can go and listen to the breakdown of the Naziah Harris case, just in case you're listening to my recap, you think that sounds interesting and you don't know where to go. We already did a recap of the case back in season 8 where we were awaiting this to go to trial, but it never did. Naziah Harris was a 13-year-old young girl out of Detroit who disappeared in 2024. The man responsible for her death was Jarvis Butts, and he was supposed to go to trial in February of this year. However, he was sentenced to 35 to 60 years in prison after pleading guilty to second-degree murder along with multiple sexual assault charges. But even with that sentence, there's still a part of this case that remains unresolved. Naziah's body was never recovered. And just weeks after sentencing, Jarvis Butts last Thursday was found dead in prison, which means the person who was supposed to provide those final answers took them with him. Investigators are investigating his death, but as of right now, they do not believe there's any foul play involved, and they believe that he took himself out. This case is complicated because I find myself not even feeling bad for the family, and that may sound pretty harsh. But when you know the details of Naziah Harris's case, the only victim there was Naziah Harris. Everybody in that scenario, family, social workers.
Your little one grew 3 inches overnight. Adorable. Also, expensive. Sell their pint-sized pieces on Depop and list them in minutes with no selling fees. Because somewhere, a dad refuses to pay full price for the clothes his kids will outgrow tomorrow. And he's ready to buy your son's entire wardrobe right now. Consider your future growth spurt budget secured. Start selling on Depop, where taste recognizes taste. Payment processing fees and boosting fees still apply. See website for details.
They failed Naziah on several occasions. All the way up into her death, they failed her. And even when they got to the sentencing phase of Jarvis Butts, and I believe her grandmother, Naziah Harris's grandmother, got up to speak, someone in the courtroom told her to shut up. And I felt that in my soul. Because what? How dare you? I have a video, if you're at all curious, on Murder in the Black Instagram of someone cornering her family and basically saying they're just as guilty as Jarvis Butts because in my estimation, they are. And this case was probably one of the most frustrating cases to see in real time because you knew Jarvis wasn't going to tell investigators where her body was. You saw how Naziah was literally given to this man to be abused. And you saw the lack of accountability from her family. It was so frustrating. One person in the comments of the post that I made when Jarvis Butts was announced dead, said he wasn't the only person who knows the location of her body. I thought that was interesting because it makes me say that means that the family was involved. I mean, because who else was a player in this case, right? But regardless, my heart goes out to Naziah. Naziah deserved better from all of us. In the bottom of my gut, I feel like we were all responsible for Naziah. We all know a Naziah. I have a daughter. I have nieces. We ought to protect the most vulnerable in our community. And children are amongst the most vulnerable. Rest in peace to Naziah Harris. Well, that will do it, y'all, for this episode of Murder in the Black. If it made you think, made you want to go deeper, make sure you send it to someone and share it with them. Everybody has an opinion, and sometimes it's not just about the facts of the case, but also the perspectives that this case gives to us all. Make sure you're subscribed to Murder in the Black on your favorite podcast platform. We are on every last one too, y'all. We're on iHeartRadio, Audible, Amazon Music. Baby, wherever you can listen to us, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, we're there. So there's no reason why you're not locked in for every new episode. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you're locked in whenever we drop. And don't forget, season 9, every episode has a deeper dive waiting for you over on Substack, where we go beyond the story and really unpack what's underneath. New episodes drop every Thursday. Storytime Steph is every Wednesday. There's no reason why you're not hearing from me during the week. Until then, this is Murder in the Black. I'll see you on the next one. Thank you.